So, I'd like to talk a little bit about interviews and focus groups and just some notes and things I've noticed through my own experiences and from studying qualitative methods for so long. So, you turned in your interviews and now you're working on focus groups and just consider and think about the topic or your focus for what you did for your interviews and focus groups. So, an interview and a focus group are an exchange between the researcher and the knower, the person who has the knowledge. And it can be very structured or it can be very conversational. Um, Very unstructured, open ended interviews might just have one question or one statement, such as, tell me the story of your life. Whereas semi structured would have specific questions that allow open-ended responses. And then structured are more like questionnaires or surveys where there are specific answers. It's often yes, no responses or just choosing from specific answer choices. So most of you have been working with semi-structured interviews, and those are pretty much the easiest ones to deal with when we get into our analysis. So who are your participants? And I asked you to think about inclusion and exclusion criteria and the pros and cons of knowing somebody or not knowing them when you're either doing an interview or having them in a focus group. And so, this all impacts and is interesting in terms of how you find and recruit your participants. So, in terms of key informants, people who can inform you of things or participate in and give you rich information, you want people who are in the know. They're the ones that know what's going on. They're the ones who have experienced what you're talking about. They're the ones who have an outlook on what's going on around what you're talking about, or people who can just provide some kind of rich information. So with my work with cancer survivors, I work with cancer survivors or I work with their caregivers. They're the ones who know what's going on. They're the ones who have experienced it. They know how things have changed over time, and it's important to them, and they have a story to tell. And there's many different methods for doing interviews. And, our social media is making it more and more acceptable to bring in different methods. And so any method of exchanging information that's open-ended would be perfect for interviews or even focus groups. In-person interviewing or focus groups help somebody to develop rapport. You're able to see the visual cues, whether somebody is upset or how they're reacting to your questions. When you're in person with somebody and you're doing an interview, you can ask for clarification or give clarification about questions you're asking, and you can ask for follow-up questions. You can probe to get deeper and deeper. But the cons are that it can be difficult to get a geographically diverse interviewing population because, it would be expensive to fly all over the place to interview people and expensive to train people all over to do so. It can be time consuming to do interviews in person and costly. In terms of telephone interviews, you can reach a very diverse geography just by calling them. But can you still build rapport? Possibly. It depends. It depends on how well you know the person or what the topic is. You can also have those clarifying and follow-up questions. But the cons of telephone interviewing is that there really are no visual triggers. You also might have to have a very short interview because after, in person, you can sit back and really talk. But on the phone, it's not as easy to keep somebody talking and focused for a long time. And they might be multitasking. You don't know what the respondent is doing. They might be driving or doing other things instead of really focusing on what you're asking them. Video conferencing is a newish thing in terms of interviews and focus groups. In this way, it's almost like the in-person. You can build rapport. You can somewhat see visual cues. You can clarify and ask follow-up questions. And you can allow for this geographic diversity if you need to. But it requires technology and it requires connectivity and a good hookup. email interviews where people type out or respond to your questions, it allows you to control where and when you're going to let a participant respond. You can again be geographically diverse. You could probably email back and forth or text back and forth clarifying questions, and the answers are already transcribed. But it might take time to get the responses back from somebody, so that is out of your control. And it requires the participant to do some work in terms of typing up answers. So they might be actually shorter than if they would have just told you in person. So think about, your interviews and the types of methods you might use in your own research, and think about the pros and cons of each type. So in terms of developing the questions that you're going to ask, and we are going to work on this, and you're going to have an assignment around, developing some of your methodological tools that you'll be working with on, when you propose your project. But basically, you really start off with a grand tour question. Something that is a very general, open-ended question. And even before I start asking questions on interviews or focus groups, I ask my participants, is there anything you'd like to share before we start with my questions? If they know what the topic is, they might have something they just need to get off their chest. When I work with cancer survivors, a lot of times they really want to tell their story of being diagnosed with cancer because it's a really difficult time and it's a really big part of how they do past that time. And so even though those are questions that I often don't ask, I will get that information because people want to just share it. And I give them that opportunity. So a main grand tour question for me might be, can you tell me what it's like to find out that you have cancer? Then I listen. I listen to their story. Maybe they need some follow-up and some prompting, or they're just not getting at some of the things I'm looking for. And so a follow-up for me might be, how were you told? And in your opinion, was this a good way to give this news? And then I listen more. I listen to their questions. I listen to what they're saying. And then I can probe more. Can you tell me more about that? Do you have anything else you'd like to add? So those are just probes. So in interviews, it's really good to have a list of questions you want to ask. That doesn't mean you have to ask every question. You have to ask them specifically as is. But it's good to have something there for you to ask questions. It's good to have a flow to your questions so that there's a story being told. So you're weaving a story together. It's good to ask for examples and stories. You want to really listen and continue from what you hear, not for what is on your list of questions. You don't want to just be like, okay, and now I'm moving on. Because sometimes if you're not listening, you'll ask a question that's already been answered. And that is really hard for somebody who's giving you their time and their story. When you don't understand something, ask for clarification. And it's good to use prompts to dig deeper and obtain richer information. So some prompts and probes include, asking somebody, well, thinking back, can you tell me about something? Or you might have a long question where you're building up your question. Tell me about the last bus trip you took with your wheelchair. What was it like? Some people are satisfied, but some are not. Some are not. How do you feel about this? Sometimes it's really good just to be silent and just let them think and not dive in and structure how they're moving forward with their own answers. Sometimes it's good to restate what a person said so that they can add more. In psychology, you often hear people say, what I hear you saying is. And then you say it, but they might say, well, yeah, and this. It's good to just prompt and give the idea that you're listening. Tell me more. How do you mean that? And in what way? So we're going to stop here, and the next set of slides will look at some examples of students who have worked with me and their questions that they've asked.